get started. A reminder that the second GDD assignment and your pitch assignment are both coming up. You will be pitching in class on November 24th, and the second GDD is due November 27th. That's 2 weeks today and 2 weeks from Friday, respectively. So if you have any questions about that, as always, feel free to reach out. If you'd like feedback on anything, of course, my door is always open. I will have the marks for the one-pagers back to you as soon as I can, hopefully by the end of the week. I've started looking through those today. And I guess before I talk about those, just to address the questions in chat, yes, those are both group projects, both relating to your final GDW challenge. They have both been posted on Canvas in dated Dropboxes now. The outlines were previously available in the course info module. Now that I have the complete group lists from James, those are both on Canvas with actual Dropboxes set up and all of that. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about, the one-pagers, just a heads up, it's been interesting from what I've seen. There's like a lot of variation. So some people went absolutely crazy, kind of based on, I showed an example in class of a one-page design document that my group and I had done when we were in undergrad. Some of the documents, they have a ton of detail in them, original visuals, really awesome stuff. You didn't have to go quite that crazy to get a good mark on this. Some, on the other hand, I think a couple of the points on the assignment outline that mentioned things like not having to have a lot of words with sufficient visuals, that implied that you would have to have some original visuals and like stuff that was really well put together, mock-ups of gameplay, level sketches, etc. So if you had only a few hundred words and then all of your images were pulled from the internet and there weren't really any gameplay mock-ups or level layouts or things like that, you're not going to get a great mark, just as a heads up. I'm going to have a look through those again after I've marked them all, just to make sure the distribution is fair. For anyone that's like worried right now, if your example looked basically anything like the one that I showed in class that had a lot of detail put into it and a couple original visuals in that, you're going to do really, really well on it. And everyone that actually sent me their document and asked for feedback on the contents, those ones were all really, really well done. So if you're sitting here panicking right now, unless you just handed in like a Word document with a couple hundred words and no real original visuals and just kind of a few screenshots from other games or something like that, you're not going to do great on this assignment. Though remember, it is only worth 10%. If you did put into a lot of detail and you kind of had a poster with a bunch of text on it or a lot of original visuals or that type of thing, you did really well, or you'll do really well rather when I release the grades. So don't worry too much about it. Okay. If you did a good chunk of words and you didn't have a lot of visuals, or if you did a lot of words but you didn't have any original visuals, that's okay too. Really, I just wanted to address the fact that though the outline did say you could get away with a couple hundred words with sufficient visuals, the implication there was that you'd have a lot of original content, or you'd be pulling stuff together in kind of an interesting way, because you did have to flesh out your concept completely. So really, it's a balance. It's either or. So or both, obviously. If you did both, then fantastic. Like, take your 9.5 or 10 out of 10 and be happy. But as long as you had sufficient detail to explain the experience basically as the rubric outlined in the outline, then you'll be good. But I just wanted to give a heads up there, and I will be looking at kind of making sure the distribution for that is fair and makes sense. Again, it's okay if you had no original visuals at all, as long as you had sufficient detail explaining your design. The reason I mention this is just because there was a point on the outline that said 200 to 300 words, if you chose them really wisely, could be enough. With sufficient visuals. So the implication there was that if you were just doing a couple hundred words, then you would really need to amp up on the visual side of things. If visuals are not your strong suit, you don't really consider yourself an artist or a photo manipulator or what have you, you leaned a bit more on text explanations, that is perfectly fine. And again, a lot of the one-pagers I've seen so far, really, really impressive stuff. Really lots of detail in terms of your gameplay and your experience, whether that was in the form of writing or original visuals, or kind of putting together a thoughtful collage of things from your inspirations and that type of thing. So you're all, just wanted to put that out there. If you have any questions or concerns about that once the grades are released, feel free to contact me. If you didn't do so well on it and you feel like maybe I misunderstood what you were going for, you can contact me. Don't feel like, my word is law and the first grade I give you is definitely the grade you're getting. I just wanted to put that out there since I probably won't be talking to you again before the grades are released, as I'm going to try and get those to you by the end of the week. Okay, so now that that is out of the way, can we resubmit tonight? I'd take the late marks. Yeah, sure. If you resubmit after the deadline, you'll be incurring a penalty, obviously, but you can do that. So if you think you can improve your grade by more than 2 out of 10 by resubmitting, feel free. If not, if there's multiple like radically different submissions, I'm probably just going to look at the one that would get a higher mark and give you whatever the higher mark would have been. So don't sweat it too much. Okay. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, today is the much anticipated, much hyped game narrative lecture. So, we're going to be talking about story and character development. We're going to be talking about how you connect with players emotionally, and we're going to talk about how you give players interesting choices and decision-making scenarios in games. So, how you make these choices interesting, the power of giving players the illusion of choice without actually giving them a choice. We'll talk about why that's interesting a bit later, and we're also going to talk about facilitating a sense of agency. So making players feel like their actions are important and the consequences of those actions have a tangible impact on the course of the game's narrative and on their gameplay. So the first section here of the lecture is going to kind of be
You're
about.
not sharing your slides if there are some
Oh,
right now.
oh my God, I'm so
I
sorry.
feel like
Okay,
there
so I'm
probably
gonna.
usually is some, so before we get
Yes,
too
I'm
far,
gonna
I'll
go
fix
put
that.
those up. Sorry to everyone in the recording as well. Thanks for that, Isaac. Okay, so this is the overview slide. I'll just leave that up while I talk a bit more about what you can expect from this lecture. So depending on what your English classes were like in high school, some of this might be review, but hopefully we'll be putting a very much game relevant twist on it. The first half of the lecture might have some repetition from your English classes, again, depending, but just to make sure all of our bases are covered. This program used to have a creative writing course. I don't think there is one anymore. There might be one that's an elective. It usually changes every couple of years whether there's actually a creative writing course or not. Okay, so telling a story, the first section of this lecture. I would like everyone to just post in chat based on your knowledge of stories, books, games, movies, and your high school English education. What are the parts of a story? What is a story made of? Right. So Colin has said start, middle, end. So yes, the basic 3-act structure. That's one way to talk about a story. Mohit has mentioned characters, conflicts, the hero's journey. Right. So we've got a mix of both story structures and elements of stories happening in the chat right now. Climax arcs. It looks like about half and half. Seems like there's a bit of a lean on the structures. You guys have probably talked before about the 3-act structure, Freytag's pyramid, the hero's journey, and we're going to reiterate those a little bit in the first half of the lecture today. So different parts of a story, hopefully somewhat of a review here. We're going to be looking at these through the example of Celeste, a game which I know I bring up a lot. There's a counter of how many times I said Celeste last year. So if anyone has access to that from one of the second years, feel free to go ahead and dust that off at this point. Now, you'll remember premise as one of the dramatic elements of games that we talked about in week 2, and premise is the basis for a story. So in the case of Celeste, there's a mountain with some kind of magical effect on the people that try to climb it, the people that live around it, and climbing the mountain is a very big accomplishment. So you, Madeline, the main character, want to climb the mountain. That is the premise of the story. Plot is what actually happens during the course of a story. So a plot in a game is basically the narrative events that occur after players start playing. After that kind of inciting action and what sets up the story, it's the events that unfold during a gameplay. So in the case of Celeste, Madeline starts climbing the mountain. She encounters foes and obstacles along the way. She needs to go stronger. She falls at kind of the climax of the story, losing all of the progress she's made so far, and you need to work your way back up. And eventually, of course, Madeline reaches the top. And yes, to address in chat, it is a very good game. There's a reason that I bring it up so much, both from a narrative and a gameplay standpoint. It's a really nicely put together package. All of the hype and awards are very well deserved. So other parts of a story, and there's kind of 5 main ones in total that we talk about. So one is character. This is who participates in the story. In the case of Celeste, there's Madeline, there's your alter ego Badeline, there's a couple of the other characters you encounter in the world, like Mr. Oshiro and the old woman, and then there's Theo, who is another mountain climber that you encounter a few times along your journey. The setting is where the story is set. So in the case of a game, this is the world. This is where the player will actually be exploring and interacting with. So different areas of the mountain in case of Celeste, Tamriel in the case of Skyrim, Aperture Science in the case of Portal. You get the picture. Theme is an interesting one. So we addressed this a little bit last week in the creative direction lecture. Theme is what a story is actually about. So in Celeste, for example, it's a game about a girl climbing a mountain, but beyond the events of the plot, we need to talk about what concepts the story addresses. So in the case of Celeste, it's not just about climbing a mountain, it's about overcoming personal struggles and trauma. It integrates themes of mental wellness, identity, perseverance, never giving up. You get the picture. So different stories will put more or less emphasis on different components, and a story is not objectively better or worse than another for, say, focusing more on the setting than the characters or more on the plot than the themes. If you have a story that is simply told, doesn't try to be super symbolic or anything, but really interesting stuff happens to the characters and the world, it can still be a really great story. This might be a bit of an odd example to bring up, and it's not specifically game related, but think of Seinfeld or many other very well written sitcoms. Not really a lot of themes being explored. The characters don't ever really learn anything, and arguably the events of the plot are they're quirky, but it never really goes anywhere. It's described by the characters as a show about nothing, and to an extent it is. But the interactions between the characters and the events that happen over the course of each little self-contained story are what make it interesting. It doesn't have to lean on deep, meaningful themes to still tell an interesting and entertaining story. And the same is true of your games. So some of the differences that you'll see between genres or different types of experiences can be something like this. So fantasy games, for example, will often put a lot of focus on setting and lore rather than trying to have, super distinct characters with really well-developed personal struggles. You might see that from your protagonist, but you're not going to see that from every lowly citizen in the world. The focus is going to be on developing a compelling world with lots of interesting realms and kingdoms and different magical monsters and all that kind of thing. Comedy works will often focus on character. So if you look at a game like Undertale, the character development in that game is actually really, really detailed for a lot of the main characters. The way they interact with each other, their dialogue, it's all very well developed. The story of the game itself in terms of plot is quite simple. It's the interactions of the characters and the development of those characters over time that makes it interesting. Some stories will lean more heavily on themes than others. So the game that we just used for a bunch of those examples, Celeste, is pretty in your face with its themes at times. It basically smacks you in the face and goes, this is a game about depression, a few times throughout the runtime. And it works, but not every story needs to do that. A game with ideological lore like BioShock, for example, that kind of talks about, man versus society and the importance of the individual and all that kind of stuff, it will tend to be more upfront with its themes. But a game that is less focused on that, that's maybe more focused on gameplay and just telling a cute, simple story with its characters, it's going to be more subtle with its themes a lot of the time. So if you look at a game like Ori and the Blind Forest, for example, where you're trying to kind of restore light to a dark world and you're hoping to eventually maybe reunite with your mother figure at the beginning who dies of starvation, the themes in that game of love conquering all, things not being as they appear, staying determined, those are really kind of subtle and in the background. The focus is just on telling the simple events of Ori kind of rescuing little characters and bringing life back to the forest and that type of thing. So how do you come up with an idea for a really compelling story? Well, you can basically use really similar ideas to the brainstorming techniques that we talked about in week 2 for coming up with general game ideas. So some popular sources for ideas for a story, if you're wondering where to get started: history, mythology, folklore, other media, basically looking to what's already out there. 90% of writing is probably adapting inspiration from other sources. There's this adage about, nobody ever having an original idea, and there can be a fine line sometimes between plagiarism and inspiration, but using a historical event or a piece of mythology as an inspiration for a story can be really interesting. You can adapt existing stories from the public domain or IP that you have licensed in the case of a game. So maybe you want to make a game about some historical event that happened 500 years ago, or say the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, because those are in the public domain now. Go crazy. You might just flat out want to take an existing story and copy it, as long as you are within your legal rights to do so, and you can make that work in an interesting way with the gameplay that you have planned. Obviously, there's a difference between taking inspiration from a story and plagiarizing it. Even if you're using something that's in the public domain, you should definitely be upfront with the fact that you're not trying to pass off someone else's work as your own. So keep track of your ideas. I said this about game ideas. The same is true of story ideas. You might have a really interesting idea for a story floating around in your head, and you're thinking, I'm not going to forget that. It's great. Why would I ever forget that? It's a cool idea. You might, and life happens. So just write things down. Maybe the process of writing it down will help you flesh out your ideas a bit more. It will provide you a starting point to work more on that idea later. Lastly, draw on your own experiences. If something interesting has happened to you in your life, or maybe you know someone that you think it would be interesting to kind of loosely base a character off of them, draw on your own experiences. This is maybe where that other 10% of originality comes from. It's based on taking your experiences in life and kind of remixing it into something interesting that you can retell to other people. I see a question in chat. What if you plagiarize from yourself with a thinking emoji? We laugh, but it's technically a thing in university. The idea of, say, resubmitting the same assignment for 2 courses is a problem. So just something to keep in the back of your head if you didn't realize that. But I digress. So story structures, there were a few of these alluded to in chat, and this is probably something you're familiar with from high school. Stories do not have to follow any given format. I cannot stress this enough. So despite all of those formats that you looked at in high school, and Freytag's Pyramid and the Hero's Journey and blah, 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 those don't apply to every story. Not every story will neatly fit into those. And just because a story doesn't neatly fit into a given literary structure does not mean that that story is bad. There are some patterns which tend to emerge repeatedly in literature and the media, which you can use as a starting base when you're starting out writing, and which can be a useful lens for analysis, but don't take them as absolute gospel. So why do we talk about them at all? Well, they can help to serve as a template when you're new to writing, to give you a starting point for figuring out what a story is missing. So if you'd never heard of a story structure at all, and you were just writing about the events in the life of a normal character, you might feel like it's missing something. And if you knew nothing about story structure at all, you might not realize that the story you're trying to tell doesn't really have a climax. So there's no buildup of tension and interesting event that the audience is working up towards, which obviously is a problem, and something that learning about classical narrative structures will help you to learn. They can help you identify what your story is missing, as I said, and it can help provide a basis to analyze others' work as well. So if you're trying to break down why the story in an existing game is something that works or doesn't for you, then using one of these structures as a lens to understand and break down what's going on can be helpful for that purpose. So we're going to discuss a couple of kind of classic theatrical and literary structures right now, starting with the simplest, the 3-act structure, which is often centered around a dramatic question. So a lot of stories are built on a question. The 3-act structure is kind of famous for it, I guess. So something simple like, will our hero survive? Will the evil stepsister fall in love? Will Sad Can rescue the kingdom from the evil can opener? You get the picture. So the first part of a 3-act structure is the setup, the beginning. This explains the premise of your story. Remember, that's the basis for what's going to happen, and provides exposition. Exposition, of course, kind of being an explanation of the world and its characters and how we got to the point that we're currently at the beginning of the story. If you've ever watched a movie and there's kind of a long, weird 20-minute scene where there's either a voiceover or a character is just wistfully reminiscing about the past, or having an odd conversation with another character talking about things that they should both already know, congratulations, you've just identified very, very blunt exposition. Kind of having really awkward exposition can be something that really makes the pacing of the beginning of a story feel awkward, so something to watch out for. Okay, so also in the beginning, an event occurs, sometimes referred to as the inciting incident, which jumpstarts the main action of the story. Next, we have the confrontation, aka the middle of the story. This develops the conflict and characters in the narrative and helps build tension working towards that big event. The audience thinking, in the case of Will Our Hero Survive, perhaps there's a duel coming up with the main villain, and the audience is going, hey, will our hero survive? That's kind of what the middle builds up to. Lastly, we have the resolution, the end, and this is where the height of the action occurs, usually right at kind of the start of the third act. We're building up to that final climax, and then near the beginning of the end, we have that climax occur. This is what ultimately breaks the tension of the story. It answers the question that was posed at the beginning: did our hero survive the duel with the evil villain or not? And then after that climax, we wrap up our story and we have some resolution. What happens to the characters next? If you're Marvel, maybe you set up the 17th movie in your franchise. You get the picture. So, the dramatic arc. What is a dramatic arc? Well, the progression of a story from beginning to end, regardless of the structure that it uses, is often referred to as the story's arc or dramatic arc. This can be visualized as a curve plotting the level of action over time, aka the level of excitement. So we talked before a bit about experience curves or difficulty curves, kind of plotting a graph showing the level of challenge or tension in a game over time. This is really similar to that and just applied to stories. So kind of one and the same if you want to think about it that way. The dramatic arc will give an indication of the audience's excitement as the story goes on. So if you're plotting one of these for a game, you should have something maybe along the lines you'd expect that the audience's excitement kind of rises, or the player's excitement rather, kind of rises as that final challenge in the game is happening. The gameplay and narrative climaxes of the game should ideally coincide so that you're building up all that tension and it feels like the narrative is actually working with the gameplay rather than having, the crazy gameplay challenge and then the big climax just happens in a cutscene. Little bit of a letdown. So you want to try and synchronize those experiences together. So let's look at an example of a common dramatic arc. I'm sure you've all seen this before. Apologies if this is giving you flashbacks to online classes in English last year. Freytag's Pyramid. So this is a simplified modern interpretation of Freytag's Pyramid, which was originally related to Greek and Shakespearean tragedies, not modern storytelling. So it's not going to apply one-to-one to every single movie or game or book that you look at. Most stories will usually spend the majority of their time building up to the climax. So this graph isn't really to scale. If it was, you'd basically see a lot of kind of the buildup happening and then the climax happening towards the end and then falling very quickly. That's what it would look like if it was more to scale. Usually, the idea here is that it's all built around the climax, that moment of the story where the audience feels really, really tense, and then there's that resolution as there's some major confrontation or our heroes overcome some big problem, or the bank robbers finally run away from the bank with their loot, that kind of thing. Usually the climax is kind of a turning point for the good guys or the protagonists who aren't always the good or morally right guys. Typically at this point, the climax in the story, it'll go from looking like the protagonists are going to lose to looking like the protagonists are going to win. That's the definition of the climax. It is that turning point. So just something to keep in mind there. So great. Let's talk more about structures common in games. On to another one that you've probably heard of from high school, the hero's journey, which is shockingly common in games. The hero's journey is a story structure that revolves around one main character, typically a strong main character, aka the hero, the protagonist. And when I say strong, I don't mean, physically strong and brutish. I mean really important to the story and really well developed. So in a single player game, typically you will experience some form of the hero's journey with the player being the hero. This is particularly common in fantasy stories and games, anything that's remotely looks like Lord of the Rings or has like a D&D vibe to it. The player will usually experience some form of the hero's journey on the course of their passage through the game. So if you're interested in this and you haven't already been insanely done with the hero's journey after high school, Extra Credits does have a great breakdown of this structure, which is linked in the slides there. So check that out if you would like. And just so that the slides are complete here, obviously there's no exams in this class, so you don't have to worry about memorizing any of this. But if you're looking at making a game with a strong single player narrative yourself, particularly if you're looking at something that has fantasy elements or fantasy themes, you might want to consider using this as a reference to kind of maybe see how you could spice up the character's journey and to see if it's paced well. So usually the hero's journey is drawn as a circle where the two halves of the circle represent the hero's ordinary life and some special or fantasy world, respectively. Sometimes you might hear this referred to as kind of the hero's descent into a fantasy world or a conflict, followed by overcoming strife within that fantasy world, and then an ascent back into ordinary life with some new power or wisdom that they have gained. This often repeats on kind of a micro scale of sorts within a story. So while you're inside the cycle, after the heroes, accepted the call to adventure and is on their way to the fantasy world, the trials and tribulations that they face individually might mirror this structure on their own. Each new Cerberus that you're beheading or Cyclops that you're poking in the eye might have its own kind of arc that goes with it. And multiple characters, of course, whether that's in a multiplayer game or whether it's in a single player game with a lot of other strong characters, multiple characters can have their own arcs. So if you would like the kind of quintessential example of this in any game, the Elder Scrolls games, the main quest narrative is usually quite similar to this. So, in Skyrim, you're living your ordinary life. You end up on a cart. You're going to be executed. The dragon comes and attacks. You decide to go and ask about the dragons. You have to climb the steps to High Hrothgar. You have to slay a whole bunch of dragons. You eventually have to kill Alduin. You can basically map it out 1-to-1 on this diagram. So any game that has fantasy theming usually follows this quite strongly, and you can generally pick out these elements in any game that has kind of a strong single player narrative. Tropes and cliches. So the words trope and cliche both refer to common patterns found in stories. These patterns are often called devices as well. So for example, a boss monster having eyes as weak points, the idea of video game weak points is a trope. They often refer to overused ideas. If your high school English teachers were anything like mine, anytime you said something that had ever been said anywhere before that was more than 3 words long got circled, and cliche was written in red pen because, Miss Young hated cliches, and don't even get me started. However, tropes can be used very well to present something which is both fresh and familiar. So putting a twist on an old idea or kind of overused. Okay, there's multiple Miss Youngs, so I'm going to assume it's not the same one. But I actually had 2 Miss Youngs in high school for different subjects. Anyways, so using an idea that is used repeatedly, and yes, these words do have different connotations. Usually a trope refers to a kind of common pattern in television or games. It's a storytelling device, whereas a cliche is kind of a phrase that is overused. Cliche usually does imply overused, but I digress. We're not going to get that nitpicky for this course. They can be used well in order to present a new spin on something which is familiar. So by using a trope that players are familiar with, you're making sure that you're meeting their expectations. If a boss has eyes as weak points, then that's something that players will expect. It will make it easier for them to get through that fight. It will make the boss familiar to them. But if you put a twist on it where, the boss starts covering up their eye after you hit it a few times, suddenly that becomes interesting. And in fact, the Hinox enemies in Breath of the Wild do just that. Sometimes they'll cover up their big weak point so that you can't hit it. It's cute. It's not something that you see done that much. And it's a play on the whole eyes as weak points idea. So feel free to visit this website here, the TV Tropes website, if you'd like to learn more about tropes and lose several hours of your life as well. But definitely something interesting. You don't have to stay away from an idea just because it's used a lot, is what I'm trying to say here. You don't want to outright copy something. You don't want your story to feel like it has all these overdone elements in it. But just because an idea is used a lot doesn't mean that it's going to feel stale or bad if you use it. Putting a nice little twist on it or using these ideas sparingly can be a really effective way to get things done. Okay, so point of view. This refers to the way that a story is told. So in first person, in writing, this is I walked down the street, I went to the store. You're hearing the story from the character's point of view. In a game, this is when you see through the character's eyes. So in a first person shooter, for example, when you're aiming, you're actually looking down sights. You're not watching your character holding up a gun. Third person. In writing, what this looks like is she walked down the street, he went to the store, they bought some apples together, that kind of thing. In a game, this is when you see the character's body. So you, as the player, are watching your character rather than seeing the game world through your character's eyes. Some games support both first and third person perspectives. Usually you'll see first person in shooters, third person in strategy games, third person usually in RPGs, though some RPGs are in first person as well. To the question in chat, what does a second person game look like? Interesting question. There is actually a rather interesting YouTube video on that. So in writing, usually the second person is, addressing the reader saying, you do this, that, the other thing. If you were playing with the idea of kind of trying to control the player, you could argue that there's kind of second person elements, maybe in something like the Stanley Parable. There's an interesting video on Driver San Francisco, I believe, that talks about kind of playing with mixing up the idea of players or characters controlling each other and that type of thing, arguing that that's what a second person perspective looks like in games. So in games, you may also have an omniscient perspective. So you could say that, in The Sims, it's a third person game because you're looking at characters, but there's also kind of a distinction to be made in games between a third person game where you are controlling one definitive character and an omniscient perspective or a God perspective where you can kind of see everything that's going on in the world and you're not really controlling one individual character. So that perspective is really common in simulation and management games. So, how can you make a story more engaging? Understanding all of these different parts of a story, understanding point of view and story structures, how can you actually make your story more engaging? Well, there's an old adage that is given to writers in movies and TV and books, to an extent it applies as well, of show, don't tell. So, in other words, you should demonstrate events and character traits and things like that through action and interaction rather than through description. So instead of saying that a character is angry, going, the man was a very angry person with a bad temper, instead, show that character actually getting angry and losing it at someone. Show them getting pissed off after an interaction and going home and destroying something they own or, putting a hole through their wall. Show that happening to the audience rather than just telling them about it. In the case of movies, this is kind of really common. The way this is most commonly criticized is that voiceovers tend to be kind of lazy. It's expository dialogue or a narration that's just kind of put over a landscape or something like that, in a galaxy far, far away, rather than actually showing the events to the viewer on screen. It can be used effectively, but usually it is better to just show what's happening. So, as an example, a game-related example, don't say Cave Johnson was an angry man. For anyone familiar with Portal, you'll know where I'm going. Instead, show the character repeatedly growing agitated and losing his temper. So Cave Johnson's Lemons rant in Portal 2, and maybe we'll play that over the break for anyone that hasn't heard it, is a great example of this. You constantly hear the character in kind of dialogue snippets and recordings getting angry, ranting about things, screaming and yelling and carrying on. You never actually get told that he's an angry character, and you don't really hear other characters go, hey, gee, boy, that cave guy sure is angry, isn't he? You actually see, or rather hear, through events and action, that character trait coming to light. Now, when we actually talk about games, we can take this a step further. So we alluded to this a little bit in the lecture where we talked about tutorial design, but I think this applies more than anything to narrative impact and making a story more engaging. And forgive my perhaps cheeky transition here, but in games, I would say we need to extend this to do, don't show. So games are fundamentally different from any other medium, whether that's books, movies, television. They are interactive. The player is actively participating in the narrative. You're not just showing them what's happening in the case of a movie or having them read something in the case of a book. They're actually participating in the course of what unfolds. The most interesting things that happen narratively, if you can swing it, should be integrated into gameplay. As great as very cinematic cutscenes can look, and games like, say, Uncharted, for example, that have a lot of cool cutscenes and very, very tightly scripted action pieces can be, really, really impactful moments are best left to be interactive where possible. And this doesn't just mean throwing in quick time events everywhere. So, as an example, and this is one of the things that really, really irks me. When games put the big bad boss's final throes of death into a cutscene where you just show one of the main characters finally beheading it or something, that's an absolutely terrible way to suddenly take control away from the player. Let the player behead the big bad monster themselves. Let them strike the killing blow. That really important narrative moment of overcoming a game's ultimate foe, or any other really narrative moment, should really engaging narrative moment, rather, something interesting, something exciting, that should be left as something for the player to do, not just something to be shown to them. So obviously what constitutes an important or interesting event will vary between games, and there can be some technological limitations on this. So if you're building a simple kind of combat system for an RPG as an indie, but you want there to be a really cool final finishing move on a boss and you want it to be cinematic, it might kind of be a trade-off. You need to decide whether you want the player to be able to strike that killing blow, or whether you're going to take away control from them simply because you don't really have the animation budget to make that moment super interactive, and you could do it a bit better in a cutscene. It does come down to a judgment call. This is, again, a rule of thumb. But in general, if you can make a moment interactive, it is going to be much more interesting. So let's look at an example of this. And I think the best way to illustrate this is through death, because an important character dying is a pivotal moment in any story. And some games, when a character dies, you feel like, yeah, whatever. And in some games, when a character dies, you feel your heart ripped out. So what makes the difference there? Well, let's look at some examples of games that tell this, show this, and then finally have you actually experience this in some way. So in Skyrim, and no hate to Skyrim, I know I hate on it sometimes. It is one of my favorite games, but there's some things that can be done a bit better. So Torygg, the High King, his death in Skyrim is a really pivotal moment in the story. It's something that happens before the main events of the story, but the only way that you ever hear about it is just through characters talking about it. So Elisif, shown here on screen, is Torygg's widow. She tells you about Torygg's death, and the dialogue isn't written poorly or anything like that, but you don't really feel for Torygg. You don't really care that much just because she's telling about it. She's telling you about it. You don't really see the impacts of it that much. You see the consequences of what happened, but you don't really see his death at all. You certainly don't experience it through the lens of any of the characters involved, which makes it kind of not a very impactful thing. In the middle, Stardew Valley plays out your grandfather's death at the beginning of the story. It's not the most pivotal thing in the world, but the intro kind of shows you your character's life. It shows you, your treasured relative dying, and it is definitely more impactful than you would expect for kind of a simple pixel art game. The game could have easily just started you off on the farm, shown you a couple of dialogue boxes that said, hey, your grandfather left you this farm. But by showing that scene of the grandfather actually kind of saying to the player, this is why I'm giving you this estate. One day, the trials of everyday life will become too much for you. This all kind of sets up the player's motivation. And were it not for that opening cutscene in Stardew Valley that shows all of this off, for those of you that are familiar with the game, or for those of you that are unfamiliar, just a bit of explanation. There is this kind of mega corporation in the game that's trying to take over this little village and farmland and put local businesses out of business. Were it not for this opening cutscene that shows you some of this before the story starts, most players would perhaps not have the hate for that mega corporation that a lot of players do. So on the right, this is a screenshot from a game called What Remains of Edith Finch, which I haven't actually had the pleasure of playing, though I have looked at a lot of different analyses of it. I've watched a lot of playthroughs of it. what this game has you do is you actually live out characters' deaths one by one in this family. They all die in very interesting, some very macabre, some very sad ways, but you actually experience those deaths through the eyes of the character as they're about to meet their end. And knowing what's going to happen, more or less, kind of not knowing how the character gets there or what their final moments were like, it keeps you interested and actually experiencing those final moments through the eyes of the character rather than just always being relegated to a cutscene or just being told, hey, this character Lewis died because he started hallucinating and decided to just kill himself by getting his head stuck in a saw. It's much more interesting and much more impactful for you to actually live through that yourself. So by having the player do the things leading up to a character's death, the game makes those moments all the more engaging and all the more impactful on the player. One other thing I would like to talk about is how you inject creativity into a story while you're writing it. So don't accept any writing rules as absolute. We've talked about some general rules of thumb, but in writing, as with any other form of art, as with visual art, as with game design itself, there are no absolute rules. Ultimately, the only absolute rule is that you're trying to make an interesting, engaging experience. You're trying to create something that will be meaningful for your players. General writing rules and advice should be used as guides, but these rules can be broken to create something that is ultimately interesting. If you follow every rule all the time, your story will probably seem formulaic. It will have that, and I don't mean any hate here, but it will have that kind of Marvel movie feel, where it's very, very formulaic. It's adhering to all the same beats all the time. All the characters are quipsters, and it has some really well-timed jokes, and you could map out the hero's journey with a microscope. It so precisely adheres to a given story structure. Things start to feel formulaic. Another way to inject creativity, ask what if questions. So, what if a story had no characters? Is it even possible to tell a story without characters? Maybe will you tell a story based on what characters have left behind in a world and just have players explore that world? What if the real story started after what you would think was the climax? So, doing that fake ending, fake out that a lot of games, especially JRPGs, have really early in the gameplay to make players think that the game's going to be kind of short, but then the real story starts up. That can be an interesting way to handle things. What if the player isn't the protagonist? What if you're just a side character in the game's narrative? What if you're the antagonist? What if you find out that you were the villain all along? These can be things that make a story interesting. They can put twists on what would otherwise be formulaic, and so on and so forth. So don't be afraid to be unconventional. I know I say this type of thing a lot, but when you really kind of push yourself beyond the bounds of what you'd expect to see out of a game, that's where some of the most interesting experiences can come up. And especially if you want to be an indie developer, you're going to need to stand out from the crowd in what has become a very saturated market. So breaking some conventions and doing something that is unconventionally interesting can be a really good strategy for that. And yeah, even if the main character is the villain, they're still the protagonist from the perspective of that story. But an interesting thing, what I kind of meant there was if you write out your story as having, from the perspective of the main character, the protagonist, and then the antagonist, what if when you actually go to take that narrative and embed it into the game, you put the player into the shoes of the original story's antagonist? That way, maybe the player doesn't have as many redeeming qualities as you'd otherwise have. Usually when a story is written with the intent of it being from the perspective of the villain from the start, it feels a little different than if you actually take an existing story and say, okay, now we're going to reimagine this in the perspective of the antagonist. That's what I meant with there. So another thing, the last thing that we'll talk about before we go on break really is the idea of emergent stories. So we talked about emergent gameplay a few weeks ago now. It feels like a lifetime ago. The idea that a player can kind of go outside of a game's intended experience and new gameplay can emerge from a basic set of rules. So for example, building Pokemon in Minecraft, abusing combat mechanics for your self-amusement without really intending to just defeat enemies quickly and just intending to play with the system, maybe make enemies run in circles or tape balloons to them and have them float above you like a stupid piñata, that type of thing. Emergent gameplay. It's a lot of fun. Stories can also be emergent. So stories can emerge naturally as players play. You don't need to have a set narrative for players to experience a story. Sometimes you don't even need a narrative at all. So, for example, if you think about a game like Minecraft or like The Sims, sandbox games that have no definite narrative, players can kind of make their own stories as they play. Another game that I'd bring up here are roguelikes. So if you look at a game like Noida or however it's pronounced, which is a roguelike game that's kind of in an every pixel is simulated type of physics-based world, you can die in all these sort of macabre ways, and you'll run into different enemies and a different layout of the world every time. You might have your own little story about how your character changes and grows through that playthrough that would be completely different from someone else's. It's a story that emerges based on gameplay. Users will often create stories for themselves. As I said, this is particularly common in sandbox games, and sometimes these can be the most memorable story moments that we will have. Putting lore in the world for players to find can also be a way of doing this, so you don't always need to shove something in the player's face and go, okay, watch this cutscene, you're going to learn about what happened in this fantasy world. Sometimes you'll discover things in the world that convey narrative information. And I don't just mean cassette tapes and journals that the player can find and read or listen to. If I'll go back to Skyrim again for another example, simply because I think probably a lot of people have played it. Skyrim has kind of a lot of environmental set pieces in different locations that will tell you things about the world without you actually having to read anything. Just by exploring those locations, you'll learn about what happened. For example, there's a lighthouse in the northwest part of Skyrim called Frostfall Lighthouse that suffered from an invasion of these giant bugs called Chorus that kind of killed all of the inhabitants. And you'll be able to discover that not just through the little notes that have been left behind, but from the bodies and the holes burrowed into the walls and that type of thing. Think about what types of events would create memorable experiences when you're trying to create these emergent stories. Give players the freedom to do things that are unexpected so that when they're creating these stories on their own, they will be more memorable. So, for example, if you can, let players kill important characters. Think of the older Fallout games rather than the newer Fallout games in this respect. Let players play around with physics. Think about the combat system in Breath of the Wild. You probably had a fond memory of sticking Octorok balloons to something and watching it float away, or of kind of abusing the ice pillar mechanic or something like that. Those are those emergent stories that you'll remember and look back fondly on your time with the game. These unexpected moments can create comedy. They can also create tension when you're not sure if a wacky plan that you have is going to work out. And they also create a sense of adventure and discovery by having you kind of learn about what you can do with the game's world. One other last note here is not to tell players absolutely everything that's possible. Leave some stuff for them to be discovered, because figuring things out can itself make for a great story as players learn about what your game will allow them to do. So we're going to come back at, let's say, 6:08 or so. Give everyone a break to grab some water, stretch your legs, maybe get some food, and we will talk a bit about character development and interesting decisions now that we're kind of beyond the basic narrative structures part of the lecture.
Hey, Samantha.
Hey, how's it going?
So you mentioned earlier about how there are like games that have like way too many cutscenes in them, and then they feel like you're barely interacting.
Yes.
That's kind of what deterred me from playing games like Walking Dead.
Yeah, that's fair. A lot of games that have that kind of heavily choice-based narrative have that feel to them. It actually took me a while to get into Life is Strange. I did enjoy it once I got through it. I thought that there were some interesting stories that were told within that game, but it took me a while to get into it just because when I first sat down to play it, I was expecting more of a gamey game than kind of an interactive movie, and it wasn't something that could hold my interest as easily as some other story-heavy games can. Not to say that it's a bad experience at all. Like I said, I did end up enjoying my time with the game, but these types of games can kind of fall into that category relatively easily. And if you want to make your game more engaging or more appealing to a wide variety of players, usually making things feel more interactive and like the player is actually taking a role rather than just directly observing a story through the lens of a character that they happen to move around the world can be a better bet. Mohit, did you have a question?
Yeah, so for the activity, can we do like a short story?
Yeah, basically, you can kind of create whatever you want with it. I just wanted to show you guys that tool because I think it's a useful prototyping tool, and you can feel free to have fun with it.
And for the short story, we can have like dialogue and stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can
Okay.
go crazy, basically.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Samantha, can we watch the lemons?
Oh yeah, totally. Let me bring up. I mean, there's no visual for it, but I'm gonna bring up the audio. Thank you for reminding me. Oh, you know what? This one's got subtitles, so I'll share my screen on this just so that it's easier for everybody to see. Okay, we got a good 2 minutes ahead of us, everybody. And I'll try and get the
probably my
audio
favorite
balance
game
right
around
on this, but it might be too loud, it might be too quiet. Let me know if any, just headphones warning, just in case.
Welcome to the Enrichment Center. Since making test participation mandatory for all employees, the quality of our test subjects has risen dramatically. Employee retention, however, has not. As a result, you may have heard we're going to phase out human testing. There's still a few things left to wrap up, though. The bean counters told me we literally could not afford to buy $7 worth of moon rocks, much less 70 million. Bought them anyway, ground them up, mixed them into a gel. And guess what? Ground up moon rocks are pure poison. I am deathly ill. Still, it turns out they're a great portal conductor. So now, we're going to see if jumping in and out of these new portals can somehow leach the lunar poison out of a man's bloodstream. When life gives you lemons, take lemonade. Let's all stay positive and do some science. That said, I would really appreciate it if you could test as fast as possible. Aaron, please bring me more pain pills. All right, I've been thinking. When life gives you lemons, don't make lemonade. Make life take the lemons back. Get mad! I don't want your damn lemons! What am I supposed to do with these? Demand to see life's manager. Make life rue the day and thought it could give Cave Johnson lemons. Do you know who I am? I'm the man who's gonna burn your house down with the lemons. I'm gonna get my engineers to invent a combustible lemon that burns your house down. The point is, if we can store music on a compact disc, why can't we store a man's intelligence and personality on one? So I have the engineers figuring that out now. Brain mapping, artificial intelligence. We should have been working on it 30 years ago. I will say this, and I'm going to say it on tape so everybody hears it 100 times a day. If I die before you people can pour me into a computer, I want Carolyn to run this place. Now she'll argue. She'll say she can't. She's modest like that, but you make her. No, put her in my computer. I don't care. All right, test's over. You can head on back to your desk.
Goodbye, sir.
And yes, I know, Sivanesh, ideally I would have, custom recordings for all of this, but believe it or not, I do not have full-length recordings of every game I have ever played at a moment's notice on my computer, so YouTube's basically the only option there that makes sense.
Make life take the lemons back.
Yeah, I absolutely love that interaction. It's just, it's fantastic. It sums up Cave Johnson's character, I think, better than any description could, or any cassette tape you could find, or little journal, or anything like that.
Great, because we never see
a
Cave Johnson
masterclass.
ever.
Well, I mean, we do see paintings of Cave Johnson.
Yeah, we see paintings of him, but we never actually see him. But we don't need to, and it's just perfect.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of characterization through perhaps the most minimal way possible. He's one of the most memorable characters of the game. He's one of the most strongly characterized characters in the game, and yet we only see a couple of pictures and hear voice clips, and that is it. I guess I'll get some lo-fi beats on in the background. And yes, I mean, with J.K. Simmons behind it, it basically had to be good, right? That's loud. Let's get that down there. Yeah, I do enjoy the lo-fi beats. Oh, Carolyn has added another background to the rotation, it looks like. Isaac has found the answer to our burning question from earlier. I
may
honestly
have.
cannot even remember what the burning question was.
You had asked how much water can you make into holy water at one time?
Ah, excellent. Is there
Supposedly,
actually official source on this?
so all I have is this singular man who has denoted himself as a practicing and well-informed Catholic. That's all I have. But apparently, it is based upon intent and control. So you have to be able to conceive the amount of water that you are doing and have the intent of blessing that amount of water. So apparently it's from anything from a drop to a large bath, because if you get more than a large bath, it's just impossible to conceive that amount.
Okay, so if we wanted to have a holy water slide,
You would
for the
need to be able to
purposes of
conceive the
COVID-safe
amount of
baptizing,
water on said water slide.
in terms of bathtubs, we'd
Yes.
like have to get a few bathtubs and then do them individually,
Yes,
probably.
that you could do. He then goes on for like way longer trying to correct somebody that everybody in like priests and bishops have the exact same level of power, and completely ignores the rest of the question after line 1.
Well,
But at least you got the answer out there. So that's apparently the answer is if you can mentally conceive the amount of water that is in front of you, then you can do it all at once.
that's actually an interesting question as well. When does holy water become unholy? Does it have an expiry date? I know this is that touching anything related to religion is a risque topic, but okay, guys. I guess that would be one way to do it, Jake.
I've heard that you can take holy water and add it to regular water to make more holy water if the ratio is 50-50.
What
So
if you then take? Does that one then have full holy power after that?
Yes, if
'Cause
it's
that
so
could
you
get
could take
that could get out of control pretty quickly.
you could take one bathtub of holy water and one
You can
bathtub
create an
and add it
exponential
to
growth of holy water.
and then have another drop, and then multiply both those drops because they're now considered holy into 4 drops. Then it just goes forever.
So it's looking
would
like
only
our
take so
baptism
many
water slide would
conversions
actually be pretty easy to make, which is good. It's good.
It would only take
On
so
the
many
subject of
conversions to turn all the
COVID-safe
water on Earth into holy water.
traditions.
Yeah, we can do this.
So is half holy water possible?
I don't
Like
know.
half of it is holy, and the other half is just like not like it's just unholy. for
Wait,
some
wait.
reason.
What happens? Yeah, what happens if you add more?
Wait,
I
I
have
came
no
back and we're
idea.
learning about holy water duping? What?
Yeah, it's a
Like,
new
if you
exploit
add
we
more
found
of a
in the world.
ratio, does it all just become unholy water now? Or like, is there a little bit that isn't
I guess
holy?
this is a discussion that we'll have to have after the lecture, since it's almost 6:08, almost time to get back to it here. But I'm glad that our conversation has evolved from the original query. And the problem of COVID-safe baptizing in a fun and entertaining environment will be something that we continue to discuss after class, I suppose. It's certainly an interesting hypothetical. Okay, so to open this half of the lecture, I would like to pose a question to everyone. Normally, I would have you shout out ideas. You can shout out in chat or just unmute yourself and shout out, and we'll see how that works. What makes a character interesting?
Personality.
Cute.
This is great.
Good backstory.
Okay,
Yeah.
backstory, personality,
Range
scars,
of emotion.
hair, range of emotions rather. Yes, I agree. Having a dynamic
Dynamic.
range of exactly dynamic. So a character feeling like
Large
they're
sword.
lively, they have moods, a large
Apparently
sword.
being Hyder.
Straight in chat, their motivations, right? Hi, they're being me, strangeness, how they look shirtless, very good. Distinct personality, right? So we're getting combinations of maybe some sarcastic answers in here, but a lot of these kind of relating to the idea of a character's backstory, motivations, them feeling like they're a real person. Okay, so this is what makes a character interesting. Another, perhaps much more subjective question: what makes a character relatable to you? Again, feel free to shout out or pop answers in chat. What makes you personally relate to a character? Big life events, right? So the
Yes.
character having something in common with you.
Similar life events. Just kind of a similar mindset, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like whenever I read about a character who's a bit of a workaholic and super anxious about their performance, I always relate to them. um, the funny, cuteness, awkwardness, right? So emulating traits that maybe a lot of people kind of fear that they have in themselves, or traits that remind you of your friends, maybe remind you of yourself. If you can, Michael has said, if I can find something similar to my life and theirs, for example, losing a loved one or having a falling out with a good friend, right? So shared trauma, much the same type of thing that might make you bond with another person, can make you kind of bond with or relate to a character in a story, whether that's a book, a movie, or a game. Another subtly different question: what makes a character sympathetic? In other words, what makes you actually feel something for a character, where you care about them, you understand why they do what they do, maybe you like that character, even if you don't necessarily relate to them, and you don't want to, for example, see them die in a fire.
If you've like, yeah, what one person said, watching them grow, kind of like watching them as they've gone through a whole bunch of stuff and then realizing, oh, okay, that's why you do this. That's your moral compass in that sort of
Yeah.
way.
So having kind of those sensible values or motivations that actually give the character a reason for making the decisions that they make, rather than them just, going around making mistakes. Another thing that got pointed out by Noah in the chat: character flaws. So actually having established traits of a character that give them a reason to make mistakes, as opposed from just, being the bad guy that's always doing bad stuff to the main characters. You might have a sympathetic villain if they've had some trauma, if they have definite flaws, if it seems like they have reasons for what they're doing. These are things that can make a character sympathetic. And when you combine all of these things together, a character that is interesting and relatable and sympathetic, that's generally speaking the recipe for a good main character. Someone the player can see themselves as, someone they can, in other words, relate to, someone that's interesting, that has an interesting backstory, or that interesting things happen to them during the course of a story, and they're sympathetic, they're likable, you actually care about what happens to them. Something Josh mentioned as well, the idea that, and this is something that Misan, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, in the chat alluded to as well, watching the character grow. So actually having the character do things and being able to understand their character traits before that piece of media expects you to sympathize with the character. So starting out with a character right off the bat that hasn't done anything, that hasn't shown you kind of their value as a person or their flaws, hasn't really given you any moments of humanity. And when I say that, obviously it doesn't have to be a human character. If a story just throws you a character without giving you any of those things, and then immediately expects you to empathize with that character, and expect you to think that the sun rises and sets out of the back of their head, it's not a good look. It's not a character that you're actually going to care about. It's just like, why is this character so important? So some quick terms before we move on. The protagonist is the main character of a story. Typically, this is the player. You can kind of have, you could do something else where the narrative of a game is very clearly centered on a character that isn't the player, in which case you're no longer the protagonist in the game's narrative, which could be kind of interesting. But usually in games, where you control a character, the player will be controlling the protagonist. The antagonist is the main opposition to the protagonist. So typically, this is the big bad guy. Maybe it's Bowser. Maybe it's the dark and evil dragon that is trying to destroy the land. Maybe it's just the big dude that hoards all the crystals of light and eternity and fire and earth. If you're playing a JRPG and you need to take them back, that's the antagonist. As a note, the protagonist does not have to be the morally good guy. So protagonist is a narrative term, not an ethical one. Like Natasha mentioned this earlier. So if a story starts out being told from the perspective of the moral villain, that villain is still the protagonist of the story. The good guy is then the antagonist. But if you were to adapt that into a game, you might have the player fulfill the role of who would traditionally be the antagonist so that the player can still play as the good guy, or vice versa. You can kind of mix and match this up to your leisure. However, usually probably about 8 or 9 times out of 10, the protagonist also happens to be the person that is the morally good guy, just because we're humans and we usually like to be on the side of the good guy, and the protagonist is much easier to be on the side of the protagonist than the antagonist. Nonetheless, stories which have villains as the protagonist can actually be some of the more interesting stories, because they tend to subvert our expectations and convey events from a perspective which is normally not acknowledged. Another good point in chat that Natasha just pointed out about morality in different stories, actually. Morals are obviously subjective, right? So good guys murder all the time in fantasy, but we don't look at them as bad half the time, right? So there's usually this idea of certain actions being justified, and obviously that's questionable. That is a pattern that has been in literature for thousands of years at this point, and is usually leaned on quite heavily in video games as well. Of course, there's the meme of D&D, you playing as a murder hobo that just goes around killing things for XP. Make of that what you will, but if you want to have some interesting moral aspects to your story, just something to think about, remembering that morality is kind of subjective, and that to get to that place where you can justify actions, you need to make sure that players are in the headspace of relating to their characters enough to justify that. If you just expect players to go around killing everyone, be prepared for players to maybe have a bit of a disconnect with the characters that are killing everyone, or else spend some time setting that up so the player can really understand the motivations of their character and while they're going on to kill everyone. Another question in chat: what if you're the antagonist but you only find out at the end of the game? Right, so that depends on the way the story is told. Again, usually if the story is originally kind of written as the villain being the main perspective, then you were the protagonist, you were just the bad guy the whole time. Though if the story would normally be told from the perspective of someone else, and you kind of put the player into that antagonist's shoes, that can be an interesting perspective. And obviously, yeah, the genocide run of Undertale is kind of similar to that. And some games do that a little bit, where if you looked at the story as it would normally be told, the player would probably be in the role of the antagonist. So when we're talking about defining a character, whether it's the protagonist, the antagonist, a side character, when we think about kind of these qualities, how do we make them interesting? How do we make them relatable? How do we make them sympathetic? There's quite a few different things that you can look at. So one is appearance. What do they look like? And appearances definitely aren't everything, but they do dictate your first impressions, particularly in terms of a game character where you don't have a lot to go on other than a character's model until, they actually open their mouths or do something. And in the case of silent characters, as many game characters are, appearance might be largely all you have to go on until they actually start doing stuff. So appearance can hint at personality traits, and since we are in the realm of fantasy and exaggeration in games, we can use exaggeration in a character's appearance to convey personality traits. So, for example, we talked about last lecture in creative direction, the idea of the shape of a character telling you something about their personality or their role in the story. For example, a round character is a friend, a pointy character is evil. And, if we have things like what the character looks like with their shirt off, as Jordan mentioned in chat, or maybe having a really big sword, that can tell us something about their personality traits. Maybe a character with a really, really big sword is brave and goes into combat all the time. Or Maybe a character with a really gigantic sword is actually kind of a coward and uses their gigantic sword to feel better about themselves. I'm looking at you, Susanoo and Okami. Okay, another thing is backstory. So what happened to the character before? And by before, I mean before you meet them, before they actually start taking an active role in the story. So how did the character grow up? How do their past experiences affect their disposition and how they act? This can be really important. If you have a character who is a bit of a dick, if you don't want players to hate that character, giving them some kind of backstory where they went through a lot of stuff with other people and they've kind of built up this shell and they don't really want to interact with anyone in a meaningful way, and that's why they're sarcastic and mean to other people, that can make what would otherwise be an unlikable character very sympathetic. Other ways to define a character. The big one, personality. What is that character actually like? And this is a lot of what was alluded to in chat when we were talking about different character traits. So is a character emotional? Are they very stoic and, you know, they never really let their emotions show rather? Are they very excitable? Are they happy about lots of different things, always excited to see the player, that type of thing? Are they angry? Are they quiet? Are they loud? You want to show this through behavior whenever possible. So that whole show don't tell adage applies very much here. Actually demonstrate the character's personality through their interactions with others, how they treat the people and world around them, rather than just saying things about a character's personality. And another big one is, of course, actions, which should generally reflect a character's personality. So what does the character actually do? Do they fight or do they prefer to talk things out? This is, in general, the most powerful way to demonstrate who a character is at their core. So the idea of a character kind of being a humorous quipster as a personality trait does not demonstrate the same level of that character's values as showing them, say, sacrificing themselves for a friend. And then lastly, we have the idea of quirks. So in games and media, quirks can be very important in terms of a character's memorability. So what's kind of a character's trademark or gimmick? This might be something that's reflected in their appearance. It might be a catchphrase. You generally don't want to go super crazy in terms of giving every character a bunch of quirks that seem really out of place and every character just has 18 catchphrases that they use. But giving characters some quirks like an unusual walk or a weird habit, the way that they speak, can be one way to really make characters appealing and charming. And one place that you see this done a lot is, funnily enough, I would say, in the Animal Crossing games. So the little characters in Animal Crossing, the villagers that can move into your village, are pretty much defined entirely by quirks. They all have a unique way of speaking. They have kind of a unique way of reacting when you actually go up and talk to them. And everyone has a few kind of favorite characters in Animal Crossing that they like to have in their village. It's very much quirk-based character development. And those different quirks appeal to different people based on your own personality, maybe what you like to see in your friends, maybe the type of personality that you look for in pets, as odd as that might sound, and that type of thing can really help to define a character. So let's look at a quick example. Everyone's favorite Smash fighter, Sans. So Sans conveys a lot of interesting character traits to the player throughout Undertale, and some of it just based on the way he looks. So when you're first introduced to Sans, he's a spooky skeleton, and, you know, he's this shadow in the woods that you meet, and you're going, okay, is this some kind of villain, if you know nothing about Undertale? But once you see him, he's round, he's smiley, he's dressed very casually in a hoodie, and this just tells you that the character is going to have this kind of goofy persona where maybe he has more power than he's letting on, but he's just kind of a goofy, laid-back guy. And what are Sans's kind of primary personality traits? Well, he loves his brother, he loves his family, other people are really important to him, and he's definitely seen some stuff based on your interactions with him and kind of the things you can find out about him. He's funny, he's caring, he's smarter than he lets on, and more powerful as well. And in the story, Sans kind of serves as a buddy or a mentor figure for the player. His claws come out, as it were, if his loved ones are threatened. So if you play the genocide run in Undertale, Sans is not going to be so nice to you, especially towards the end. But in terms of characterization, there you go. That's his personality. It's reflected overtly in his actions. So whether or not he battles the player based on what you do, it's really kind of all reinforces those central character traits of just being devoted to loved ones, but otherwise being really kind of funny and laid back. And Sans also has quirks that fit with these character traits, which make the character even more likable. So making bad puns to go with that kind of funny, laid back attitude, being a bit of a glutton that loves fries. All of these things play into that persona and make this character shockingly rich, given that, he's 64 by 32 pixels or something like that. Kind of a shocking amount of depth that's achieved for this level of visual fidelity, perhaps. So more about defining a character, basically tips on how you make a character that's likable rather than someone that feels like kind of a plank of wood that nobody is going to like. Don't try to fully define a character at the start of a story. This is a Herculean undertaking. You almost never want a character who's completely predictable from the start, simply because no one really likes a story that's completely predictable. And because if you want to fully define a character at the start of a story, you will usually have a lot of really, really long cutscenes and expository dialogue. And especially in a game, we kind of want to avoid that. So let characters reveal their nature through their actions during the story. Don't just tell us about what the characters are like. Actually, let them act in the game and let us, the players, learn about those characters through what they do. Let them demonstrate to the player who they are. And most importantly, let characters change and grow throughout the story. You don't, generally speaking, want a character to be the exact same person at the beginning of the story as at the end of the story. If there's no growth, if they never learn anything, if they never build skill in anything, it's not really that interesting anymore. Character development is part of what helps prevent a story from feeling shallow and boring. If characters finish in exactly the same place as they started, unless you've got some kind of poetic symmetry going on and that stagnation is for comedic purposes, it's usually better to actually have the characters learn and grow in some way. Another thing I would like to talk about is the concept of archetypes. So archetypes are common character patterns. You can kind of think of them like tropes for character design. Archetypes describe a character's role and the typical traits of that type of character. These can be useful as a starting point for characters to fill roles in your story. So examples of archetypes in literature would be the hero or chosen one. So this is the main character trying to save the world. The prophecy foretold that there would be a man one day with a wart on his left eyebrow that would rescue the earth. That's the hero or the chosen one. You've got the villain who causes problems for the hero, the doppelganger who is perhaps a mirror of a character, often representing their dark side, looking at you, Madeline and Badeline from Celeste. And you've got the mentor as well, who's a protector or advisor of the main character. Now, obviously, you don't want to just follow an archetype boilerplate to the letter as a basis for a character. That's a quick way to create a character who feels formulaic and kind of boring. But if you're looking for roles for people to play in your story, using and understanding archetypes can be a good starting point for that. So archetypes can also define common traits and abilities. So in games, you'll often hear the word archetype used in reference to really kind of common character builds for fantasy games or perhaps in shooters as well. So in fantasy, the three kind of big archetypes, and obviously there's a lot, you could go through all the D&D classes if you wanted some examples, but the big trinity of fantasy archetypes is usually some kind of magic user, some kind of heavy combat character who's a warrior, and then a stealthy character who's a thief. And the image I have here is from the game Trine that basically has you cycling through these archetypes during play. It's quite a fun game, actually. But in games, archetypes don't always just refer to the role that a character plays in the story, but also kind of the type of gameplay that they represent and the types of abilities that those characters would have. So how do you actually design a protagonist in a game? One way is through a blank slate. So this is often used for playable characters. A blank slate design is when a character has little or no definite personality or backstory. And yes, obviously this can make a character less interesting. However, for a main character, it's sometimes what you want, which we will discuss over the next few minutes. So this can help prevent players from feeling forced to accept a backstory they don't identify with. Fallout 4. So having a blank slate character can make it easier for players to put themselves in the shoes of the main character, since they're not being forced into any given personality or backstory. This can also help players project onto their characters. So it works better, a blank slate design, when there's no kind of definite path that all players must absolutely follow. So if you're building some kind of open world game with a non-linear narrative, having a blank slate design can be really great, because it lets players think, okay, this character is just me. I'm in this world as I want to be. I'm doing what I want to do. I'm going to live out my gameplay through this character. But you're not having a backstory or a sequence of events imposed on you that you can't relate to. So this can be really great for RPGs, open world games, sandboxes, anytime you don't really have that definite path. You want to use this sparingly, though. It fits really well with that type of sandbox formula. It doesn't necessarily fit so well with a game that has a really kind of strict linear narrative, because then your character doesn't really feel like they fit into the world of all these other characters that are pretending to have known you for 15 years, when you're just saying, wow, I do not have a personality at all. So without their character having a defined motive, for example, players will also not necessarily feel as motivated to do what it is that you want them to do. So you really need to make sure that your gameplay and other elements of your story are pushing the player forward to do what you want them to do, if you're not going to give their player a really definite motivation. And one way that you can kind of put a twist on this blank slate design is to give the player's character relatively little characterization, but to have an inciting incident that gives them a very definite motivation. So for example, in the Portal games, even though your character doesn't have much of a defined personality apart from being very determined, which is something that other characters allude to, those inciting incidents at the beginning that make you want to escape from a kind of almost abandoned science lab will keep you going in terms of your character's motivation, even though the character's personality, backstory, and that is mostly left to the imagination. The opposite of blank slate design is more characterized design. So this is when characters have a strongly defined personality, backstory, and so on. This works really well for games that have a set or linear narrative structure, or games that are, for example, based on some existing fantasy IP where you want to tell a really strong story of a beloved character, for example, the Witcher games. It works well if you also really need to have a defined relationship between the player and one or more other characters. As I said, if the player is a totally blank slate, if another character goes, hey buddy, it's you, I haven't seen you in 5 years and you were my best friend as a child growing up. If you've just got this blank slate design where the players completely inserted themselves into the character, it's like, oh, you know, maybe I can't really believe that. But if you have a more characterized design for your main character that's more fully fleshed out, this can make more sense. Obviously, you still need to be careful with this. So some pitfalls of this. The most common one really is that having an overly characterized main character with a defined backstory and super concrete motivations and, you know, has quirks or character traits that the player might not be able to relate with, is that it can cause a disconnect between the player and their character. So let's look at some examples of how blank slate and characterized design have been used both effectively and maybe not so effectively in different games. So these are really simplified examples, and there's kind of a spectrum from blank slate design to characterized design, just to get that out of the way. But this is just to kind of get you thinking about what works and maybe what doesn't, depending on the context of different games. So in games like Skyrim or any of the Elder Scrolls games or any RPG with a character creator, this type of thing works because there's, generally speaking, a lot of player freedom and there's lots of different play styles. So giving the player a blank slate on which they can kind of impose their own design and their own motivations and their own backstory and role play for whatever character they want to create works really well in that context. On the flip side, if we have a game like Metal Gear Solid, where the protagonist is pretty heavily characterized and has a lot of lore relating to them, extensive backstory, personality traits, and so on, the characterization works here because of your relationship with other characters in the lore, the fact that you're continuing an overall saga that's built up from multiple different games. So if you're a fan of the series, it really just wouldn't work if you weren't playing as Snake, would it? And it also helps to establish humor and drama and these very characterized relationships in between different people in the game. In Portal, Chell, the main character, isn't that characterized. It works great as kind of a semi-characterized silent protagonist, but it wouldn't necessarily break Portal if the main character had some more character, if she had a more defined backstory. It's not going to suddenly ruin the game. The core of the game is about puzzling and escaping this abandoned facility. It's not going to break the game if your character suddenly has a backstory that you don't necessarily identify with. Fallout 4. This one's tricky, and maybe it depends on kind of what your experiences were going into the game and whether you were willing to kind of accept this rescue your child narrative. But it's a bit weird because Fallout 4 is a very much open world game where you're supposed to be able to complete any missions in any order that you want, do anything that you want, side with any factions that you want. So having this main quest imposed on you that is very much related to your main character, that is find your child, you care about your family more than anything else that you saw in the first 5 minutes of the game, and that was it. It's a disconnect for lots of people because you can't really fall into the shoes of that character as easily, and because the main story isn't super definite, and the game does not just say, okay, we're focused on telling this really compelling main story. It's not about that. It's about being an open world. So having this super characterized protagonist, even though you can customize their appearance, doesn't so much work for the game. So the silent protagonist, which is a concept related to blank slate design, but doesn't always imply that. Sometimes you can have a silent protagonist who is very much characterized. A game's protagonist is often silent with no voice lines or no dialogue at all. This is for a couple of different reasons. One is that it can help players project themselves onto the character. Another is that voice acting is very expensive, and the player's character would probably need to do more talking than any of the other characters if they did. Another reason is that this doesn't completely conflict with the idea of characterization. So you can still retain some definite personality traits in a silent protagonist. So for example, Link in The Legend of Zelda might be a silent protagonist, but he's definitely not devoid of character. He has a personality. He has a lot of lore behind him. If you think about Breath of the Wild with the flashbacks to his interactions with Zelda, just the way he behaves and reacts to things and his bravery and that type of thing, he has some definite personality traits even though he's a silent protagonist. Chell in the Portal games is even less characterized than Link, but you have the qualities of, tenaciousness, never giving up, intelligence, stubbornness. Even though she's a silent protagonist, she still has some characterization. Oftentimes, the protagonist's quote-unquote personality will be revealed by the actions the player is taking during gameplay. So not having the player's main character talk does not automatically mean that the player's character is not going to have a personality. So knowing all of this, hopefully at this point you kind of are getting a picture in your head of how to create a good character. I want to talk briefly about how to create a bad character. So some of the things that can happen during the character design process that will make your design fall flat. Remember that a character isn't just a list of traits. When you're starting out as a writer, it can be very easy to go, okay, you know what? I'm going to make this wizard character. He's going to be great. He's like a superhero. He's super funny. He's super brave. He's a master of all the element spells, and he's really smart. Just having that list of traits without a definite motivation or personality can make a character feel really flat, and it can also have a tendency to make a narrative feel kind of amateurish. There's a reason that it's not so much like this anymore, but maybe about 10 years ago, games kind of had a reputation for having bad writing. Characters are ultimately people or animals or things, but they have personality. They're not just a list of qualities. Some common pitfalls of character design, common poor character designs, probably the most famous one is a Mary Sue. So a character that has absolutely no flaws, comes across as a do-gooder that would never consider breaking the law or doing anything wrong at all, Little Miss Perfect. Very annoying, generally speaking, and not very interesting. Characters need some flaws, some interesting motivation. Even a character who wins all of the time can be interesting if maybe you throw in a character flaw or some kind of depression or internal struggle that they have. Just having a character who's Little Miss Perfect, who's happy all the time, generally speaking, is a good way to get your audience to hate that character. Now, if you want your audience to hate that character and you want that character to look like they're putting up a front, that kind of design can actually be effective. But the idea of a Mary Sue character is probably the thing that will cause the most arguments in terms of whether a character is good or bad. I can already see some Star Wars conversations happening in the chat. Yeah, the franchise is kind of notorious for that type of main character design. So there we go, especially in the prequels and the latest trilogy. Anyways, another poor character design is a self-insert. So if you've ever read bad fan fiction, the main character probably suffers from both Mary Sue and self-insert syndrome. So this is when the writer injects themselves into the story. Putting a bit of a piece of yourself into a character is not a problem. Writing about what you know is a good strategy. However, inserting yourself into a story and then, putting yourself with the super attractive character as a partner and then having you achieve all the great things and going, this character, she's great. She's a brunette. She's got like some red in her hair and she's a teacher and she totally rules at life. If I wrote a story like that, it would be horrible. You should never just insert yourself into a story and then try and make yourself perfect. It's not a good look for a story, but it's something fairly common to see in kind of amateurish writing. So definitely something to stay away from. Another poor character design that's really common is the idea of a one-sided villain. So a bad guy with no tangible motivation who is bad for the sake of being bad and character bad and wants to destroy the world because he's bad. That is also a quick way to make your narrative fall apart and feel amateurish, because if your villain isn't interesting, do you really care about fighting them anymore? The answer is generally no. I mean, of course, you don't want the world to be destroyed, but if you wanted to play a game with generic bad guy, you could go play some really, really big budget JRPG from the early 2000s. You're not necessarily going to just play any game that has that big bad guy who is bad because bad guy bad. So that's basically that. Another thing is designing interesting characters. So on the flip side, how do we avoid those pitfalls, sum up everything that we've talked about, and actually create interesting characters? Well, give your characters both flaws and redeeming qualities. I'm sure you don't know anyone in real life who is either, totally repulsive and has no redeeming qualities at all, though I can think of one public figure who fits that description, but moving on. You probably can't think of anyone who is completely perfect and has no flaws at all either, because that's just not interesting. And it's not something that's interesting to read about. It's not something that happens in reality. That's why it's not interesting. Heroes don't need to be perfect, and villains do not need to be perfectly evil. In fact, if you have perfect heroes and perfectly evil villains, you're going to have a boring story. Characters are more interesting when they have complexity, in other words. Another thing is to make sure that your characters have defined motivations. So it should be clear, or at least eventually made clear, why a character does something. This is another reason why bad guy does bad thing, because bad is such a bad idea. And Natasha mentioned this in chat as well, making the villain seeming like they believe what they're doing is just. That is the most straightforward way to make a villain interesting usually. You can have villains that are doing things that they know are wrong because it gives them some kind of sadistic pleasure. That can be an interesting storyline as well. But one easy way to kind of fulfill this role is to make sure that both sides of the story believe that they're justified. Of course, one side is going to be more flawed in those beliefs than another, or perhaps both sides are. This is what makes it interesting. Essentially, this point is about making sure that your character's behavior makes sense, because if it doesn't make sense, then that character is going to be less believable. Another thing to make characters interesting is to put those characters into tricky situations. So put a character into a situation where there is no perfect answer, because a character should not always be making the best choices. That's not realistic. It's not interesting. Sometimes it might not be clear what the best choice even is. So by having characters make those difficult decisions, you make them more interesting and complex. And the idea of these difficult decisions brings us to the last part of this lecture, which is player choice. So generally speaking, you want players to feel a sense of agency. What does this mean? So Agency is the capability of someone to act and make choices on their own. In other words, you can kind of think of it like free will and the power to exercise that free will. So when players have agency, or when players feel like they have agency, they feel like they're in control of their gameplay and or the story. They feel like the actions they're taking actually have some impact on what is going on. They feel powerful. When players don't have agency, they're not really in control of what happens and they feel powerless. Of course, a lot of the times in a linear narrative, players ultimately don't actually have any agency over what is happening. You just want players to feel like they are of consequence in the story, even if that's not really true. You want them to feel like what they're doing through their gameplay has an impact on what's happening, which is again another reason why you don't want the cutscenes that have all the interesting narrative stuff to feel completely disconnected from what the player is actually doing in their gameplay. And I do not mean to hate on cutscenes at all with all this stuff I've been talking about of, don't just put everything into a cutscene, don't dump 30 minutes of cutscenes on your players at the beginning. Cutscenes can be a very effective tool. All I mean to say is that they have to connect to gameplay. So when narrative things happen, it needs to feel like the players actually had an impact on that for the player to feel like they're having a rewarding game experience. So both approaches of players actually having agency and actually not having agency have their place. But generally speaking, you always want players to feel like they have agency. Unless you're going for some type of artistic game where the message is, there is no free will and you're powerless to do anything about this, usually you want players to feel like they have some form of agency. So agency in general feels great. Taking it away temporarily can also lead to some really powerful story moments. So having that lesson at certain moments in the story that are pivotal being you couldn't have done anything about this even if you wanted to, or maybe you have a choice in other areas, but this time you don't, can be something that's really powerful. So for example, in the first Portal game, incinerating the companion cube seems like it's a choice at first. If you're like me, you probably tried to figure out a way to save it, but without glitches or secrets, you can't. Players are given the illusion of having a choice, but that choice is never really actually there. You think you have agency, you realize you don't, and this results in a powerful moment in the story. So we talked about this way back in, I think, the first or second lecture, the idea that games are a series of interesting decisions. So this is the lecture where we actually dig into that a bit more and talk about what those interesting decisions are, at least from a narrative perspective. So what is a decision? Well, a decision is selecting from alternative courses of action. I'm sure you experience this multiple times in your everyday life. The consequences of decisions can have different implications. So some common examples: ethical implications. What's the morally right or wrong choice? Is someone going to suffer based on the action that you choose? Economic implications. So what will benefit the player's resources? And lastly, interpersonal implications. So how will the decision affect a character's relationships and or the narrative? And usually, to make a decision really interesting, these outcomes can be in conflict with one another. So for example, the decision that gives you more money or resources in a game might be the one that is ethically wrong or might damage your relationship with another character. Sometimes you'll need to choose between decisions that affect one thing more than another. So are you going to take a monetary hit and boost your relationship with another character? Or are you going to take a pile of money and then the other characters don't really care about you? This is kind of the factors that you're balancing in your head when you're making a decision. So what are the parts of a decision and why are we breaking this down so much? Well, when you're giving players decisions, sometimes it's not so simple as just saying, are they going to kill this character or let them live? And understanding the parts of a decision can be really helpful for this reason, particularly if you're making an RPG or say a visual novel, anything that kind of has that choose your own adventure vibe to it. So the basis for a decision is why the decision needs to be made. It's the premise for the decision, if you will. And a decision needs to have a compelling premise. It needs to seem important. Otherwise, players are going to go, well, this is stupid. Why are you forcing me to make this choice? This character wouldn't actually have to make this choice. I'm looking at you, Titanic. There was room on that door for both of them. The premise of the decision makes no sense. Alternatives are the choices that are available in a decision. So if there's only one thing to be done, then the scenario is not a real decision. Looking at you, dialogue wheels in Fallout 4. If the options are yes, yes but sarcastically, ask a question and then say yes, or say no but you just have to come back and say yes if you actually want to move forward, that's not a real decision. So you're not actually giving your players a choice in that moment. Lastly, we have the outcome or consequences. So what will happen? These can be known or unknown. In games, usually some uncertainty can be beneficial to player interest. This is both because it's more realistic. In real life, you don't usually know the absolute all the outcomes of your decision before you actually make it. Sometimes you do want certainty, though. So, for example, in a strategy game or a tactical situation, you might want players to be able to figure out the exact consequences of one particular action. Having too much RNG in terms of whether a player's units will be able to make a shot or something like that can be really, really frustrating, since the interesting part in those types of games often comes from carefully crafting a plan over time. And the last thing you want is for players to get really frustrated with RNG. Now, if we evolve this concept of a decision, we can start talking about something called a dilemma. So a dilemma is a decision where there is no clear answer because no choice is absolutely certain to yield a favorable outcome. This is kind of the textbook definition of a dilemma. And you can kind of reduce this down and say, well, isn't any decision that has uncertainty then a dilemma? We can argue about that all day. The important thing to remember here is that the dilemma is just a really difficult decision where absolutely none of the alternatives guarantee an outcome that is objectively favorable. So in the strictest sense of the term, a dilemma typically offers only two alternatives. So in a game, if you're choosing to kill or spare a character, this is something that usually is framed as a dilemma. Typically, dilemmas require a lot more thought to select a choice than any regular run-of-the-mill decision. So if you're choosing whether to kill or let a character live, it requires quite a bit more thought than whether you are going to buy the gold sword or the silver sword at the store. And dilemmas are interesting because they can be used as a source of narrative conflict. And a kind of something that got alluded to in the chat. I think Natasha brought this up again. Natasha, I assume very interested in narrative based on some of the comments being made today. Thank you for your participation. The idea that you hate kind of fake choices. So this is something that's interesting in regard to game development, I will say, because actually making a branching storyline in game development where all of the players' choices are really impactful and significantly change the course of things is difficult. Both for tech reasons, for content reasons, it basically blows up the scope of a game's development, which is why you see these types of things where it's yes, but sarcastic, yes, but ask a question. The main reason is because it's just technically very difficult. So one kind of clever thing that you can do to sort of massage things, especially for a first-time player's experience, is the idea of having a narrative that rather branching out like a tree into a whole bunch of possibilities that very quickly goes out of control and makes a scope that is difficult for your team to achieve, is that you can kind of make the branches connect back together. So decisions will definitely have some short-term impact on the events that are happening, and they might have a long-term impact in terms of how characters will treat you or the type of dialogue that they'll use to address you, but the story will tend back towards the same ending or couple of endings no matter what. Some games do this better than others, but that's just kind of one tool that you have in your arsenal to give players kind of fake choices that will still seem real and thus still be rewarding and fulfilling for players that are experiencing your game, especially for the first time. So the most famous dilemma, and some of you may have heard of this, so just a quick indication in chat. Who has heard of the prisoner's dilemma before? Anybody? Or is this new to you all? Ariana has, okay. Maybe it's new, not I. Just pull the lever. You're thinking of a different one?
So sorry, is this from Batman, the movie? It's like the movie. It's like the one with two boats.
I'm not familiar. The prisoner's dilemma is kind of a classic thought experiment, so it may have been used in Batman. I'm not surprised. It's pretty common to see this type of thing happening in popular media. So even if you've never heard of the prisoner's dilemma, you've probably seen it used in a book or a movie or a game before. So this is how it works. Two people have been arrested for petty crimes. You're one of them. You're suspected of conspiring on a larger crime, but the cops have no evidence of that. So they can get you on the little thing, but they're suspicious that you conspired on something much bigger together. So here's how it works. If both of you stay silent, you both do a year in prison for that petty crime you got arrested for. If one of you squeals on the other one and the other keeps their trap shut, the snitch goes free and the other one does 20 years in jail. And if both of you squeal, you both do 5 years in jail. So what would you do? Why? Would you stick to the family? Would you honor your code? Would you do your time and, you know, be a criminal of honor? Or are you going to sing like a canary, rat out your partner and just hope that you run free and that you don't end up in jail together? Because, you know, well, I guess if you both squeal on each other, then you're both going to shank each other. But I digress. What are you going to do? Well, let's have a look at what the outcomes look like for both you and your partner. So what is your jail time? Looking at these kind of diagrams can be a little bit confusing, so we're going to walk through it. The way you kind of read this is consider each row as an option. So let's just think through this hypothetically. We don't know what our partner is going to do, so let's think through all the possibilities. Well, first, let's think about our partner keeping quiet. Let's assume our partner keeps quiet. If we keep quiet, we do a year in jail. If we squeal, we get freedom. So in the situation where our partner keeps quiet, it's better for us to squeal because we get to go free. Let's consider the other option where our partner squeals on us. If we keep quiet in that scenario, we do 20 years in jail. If we squeal in that scenario, we only do 5 years. So in the case where our partner squeals, it's better for us to squeal because we'll be doing less jail time. So no matter what our partner does, the outcome for us would be better if we rat them out. Now let's look at it from our partner's perspective. So this time we'll read from the columns as the option. So let's assume that we keep quiet. From our partner's perspective, if they also keep quiet, they do some jail time. But if they squeal, they get to go free. Now if we squeal, if our partner decides to keep quiet, they do 20 years in the slammer. But if they squeal on us as well, they only do 5. So from our partner's perspective, no matter what we do, it is better for them to squeal on us. Objectively, the best decision for an individual, no matter which side you are on in this dilemma, is to squeal. However, when we look at what the outcome looks like in this situation for the group, a very different picture emerges. So the total jail time, the group outcome. Looking from our perspective, if our partner keeps quiet, if we keep quiet, the total jail time is 2 years. If we squeal, it's 20 years because our partner will do 20 years. If they squeal on us, if we keep quiet, it's 20 years. And, you know, if we squeal, it's 10 years. So depending on the case, the best decision is different in this case. And of course, the best outcome is when both individuals keep quiet. The outcome for the group then is only 2 years of jail time as opposed to 10 or 20 years of jail time. So what makes this scenario interesting? Well, it's not immediately obvious which decision you should make as an individual because you don't know what your partner is going to do. You need to think through all of the options. None of the alternatives are ideal for everyone. So to paraphrase the end of National Treasure, somebody has to go to prison, Ben. But the rational choice for the individual to squeal is the irrational choice for the group. The best outcome for the group is when both parties keep quiet. Now, what is the lesson here? Well, in short, difficult decisions are interesting decisions. If you give players a dilemma where they're not sure what other characters are going to do, where the outcome for them as an individual does not necessarily match up with the best outcome for the group, this creates a much more interesting decision. And yes, to address what's going on in chat, yes, the lesson in the context of what happens is, though, don't rat, because what happens to rats is not good. Never go against the family. But the point here is that basically if you give players interesting, difficult decisions, gameplay will be more engaging as a result. Your story will be more engaging as a result, because if you're always giving players an obvious choice that's not really a hard decision, that's not really a dilemma, it just becomes boring. Players don't want to make those choices anymore because they don't really have any consequences and they're not interesting. They're too easy. Easy choices are, or easy decisions are boring decisions. difficult decisions are interesting decisions. A last thing that I'd like to talk about is the illusion of choice. So sometimes a player is led to believe they are making a decision when they are not. So maybe their hand is eventually forced or their choice is futile. This can create a powerful narrative moment in terms of something seeming inevitable, it being dread that no matter what you do, the world is going to fall to ruin in the end. Maybe their choice doesn't have as profound an impact on the game as they would like it to. Again, this can be really frustrating, but depending on how it's framed narratively, it can also be a good thing that sends a message about futility or dread or, the bad guys winning in the end because not the good guys just don't always win. That can be interesting as well. This can be used to give players a false sense of agency while keeping scope reasonable. So this is what I was talking about when I was addressing Natasha's point earlier. It can be really, really, really difficult to actually create all of those branches where the player's decision actually has a big impact. So giving players choices that don't have such a big effect on the story can be one way of accomplishing that. Maybe their character in the end will be revealed to have a limited free will. So even though the player was making decisions during their gameplay, at the end, narratively, it's revealed to them that they don't have any free will. This is kind of a twist that happens in the first BioShock. And this can just be an interesting story moment. This is not always a bad thing if used well. It can be interesting, but sometimes, as I said, it can be really frustrating. So I'll take Life is Strange as an example. Some of the choices you make in Life is Strange is interesting. It's definitely an interesting experience. It's a game that I enjoyed. However, thrown away. They don't really impact much from one episode to another, generally speaking. And at the end of the game, you'll end up making the same choice no matter what you did throughout the game, which can be pretty frustrating. Another example to kind of go to the first one there is that sometimes a character is always going to die no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try to save them. So in the neutral run of Undertale, Asgore is going to die no matter what. That type of thing, no matter how pacifist you are, can suddenly rip choices away from the player when they thought they had a choice, and that can create a really interesting or kind of heart-wrenching narrative moment. So before I let you guys loose on today's exercise, to recap what we talked about some parts of a story and different story structures in the first half of a lecture. If you're looking to make a story-driven game, you're maybe not sure where to start, don't have a ton of experience with creative writing, definitely something to keep in your back pocket. It can be a helpful start, but you don't have to follow every rule. Like we said, you don't want your story to feel formulaic. You want to generally integrate narrative with your gameplay. We talked about the axiom of do, don't show, don't tell, basically making pivotal moments in a story as interactive as possible for the player. We also talked a bit about what makes interesting characters, so giving characters both flaws and redeeming qualities, making sure that they have sensible motivations. And we also talked about player agency, players having a sense of control over a game, feeling like their choices actually mean something and are actually interesting. So next time, what we're going to be talking about is some business stuff. Next week's lecture, I'm not going to lie to you, not the most interesting thing in the world, but we're going to try and spice it up with some fun case studies and controversies in the world of game dev that should give you an opportunity to work through some stuff with your groups. So we're going to talk a bit about the structure of the game development process, stages of production, management, communication skills, how to work in your GDW groups without tearing each other to pieces in this past couple of weeks. And we're going to talk a little bit about marketing as well. We're going to do some little mini case study activities. So in your groups, you'll be given some real game dev dilemmas from the past few years that have caused a lot of consternation in the public eye, and you'll figure out how to approach those in a perhaps better way than the developers did with the power of hindsight. So that'll also be an opportunity to maybe rip into some things that have made you angry about game dev in the past couple of years. And this will be in your GDW groups, yeah. So one last thing before we talk about the exercise, please fill out this form linked in the slides and written in the link there. They're both the same link. If you'd like to request any bonus topics to cover in the class, and I will try and work them in to a future week, probably any content that we have time for after the pitches in week 11, or maybe something tacked on to the end of the final lecture in week 12. And this week outside class, in terms of game stories, I'd like you to think about how players can have an active role in games stories. So if you've ever been playing a game and felt like too much control was taken away from you, or maybe you felt like you didn't have enough of a role in the story, maybe think about how that could be adapted to give you more of a meaningful role in the story. And related to that, what we will be doing for the exercise today is to create interactive stories. So there is this tool called Twine that is pretty cool. It's entirely usable in a browser. If it's not working in your browser, try a different one. Try Edge or Chrome or, common browser. You can download it if you want. If you're really interested in kind of prototyping interactive fiction or prototyping stories for your games, feel free to install it. But if you don't want to have a bunch of extra software on your computer for an in-class exercise, you can just use the web app. You can make absolutely anything you would like with it, but try to provide at least 2 interesting decision points. And yes, you don't have to use Edge. I used Chrome with Twine and tested it, and it worked just fine for me. So whatever browser you're using will probably work. If you need some ideas, maybe try and recreate part of a game that you enjoy as a choose your own adventure. It does not have to be a totally original story that you're coming up with. You can adapt something. You can maybe take a game that you like and go, I'm going to make this into a really short text-based adventure of just the opening scene of the game or something, or maybe the climax of that game. You could reimagine part of a story from a favorite book or a game or a movie with a twist. Basically play around with Twine for the next hour, make something that has a couple little decision points, and submit the HTML that gets exported from Twine by 11:59 p.m. tomorrow on Canvas. And the way Twine works is that it saves, it's got instructions and it tells you about this, but it saves in your browser, so you don't have to worry if your internet dies or something like that. You don't have to create an account or anything like that. So just try and have some fun and make something that you like. You could use it to imagine what part of your GW game would look like as a series of decisions as well. So it's really up to you. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Other than that, we are done. I'll throw the activity instructions back up in a moment, but you are free to go. And thanks for coming out. Bye, everybody. This is not in groups. This is individual.
Sorry, where's the web app? How do I, because
if you just go to that address there, there'll be like a button that says use in browser or something like that. I'll double check where it is. Right, so in the little download sticky note, there's some download links, and then there's text that says use it online, and you can just click that and it'll load up in your browser.
All right, I see it. Thank you.
No worries. And I'll go ahead and stop the recording now. So for anyone that caught this after the fact, bye-bye.